The wedding no one understood. The morning rose softly over the Tuscan hills, the kind of dawn that felt less like a beginning and more like a blessing quietly unfolding. Warm light slid across olive trees and stone paths, touching the ancient villa where the world believed it had gathered for a celebration of fame. The air carried the scent of earth after rain, mixed with distant church bells that rang not loudly, but with patience, as if they understood that this day was not meant to rush. This was the wedding everyone would later talk about, the marriage of Ana de Armas and Tom Cruise, an event the world expected to glitter with cameras, applause, and headlines. Yet beneath the surface of luxury and polished smiles, something far deeper was already in motion, unseen, unheard, and infinitely more powerful. Guests arrived in waves of quiet awe, their conversations floating through the courtyard like silk. Dresses shimmered, glasses clinked, and laughter echoed against centuries-old stone. But even as the celebration bloomed, there was a sense of restraint, an almost reverent pause in the air, as if the place itself remembered other stories, other promises whispered long before this one. Anna stood in a sunlit room upstairs, her gown catching the light like water under moonlight, her reflection staring back with eyes filled not just with joy, but with something close to disbelief. Happiness, she had learned, could feel overwhelming when it arrived after long seasons of uncertainty. She pressed her palm lightly against her chest and whispered a quiet hope that she would be worthy of the life she was stepping into. Elsewhere in the villa, Tom moved easily among guests, offering smiles and warm greetings, yet even his familiar confidence softened in moments of silence. Marriage had a way of stripping away performance, leaving only truth beneath the surface. He felt it now, standing at the edge of a moment that could not be rehearsed. This was not just a union celebrated by the world. It was a promise that would demand more of him than applause ever had. No one noticed the man who arrived without spectacle. There was no procession, no photographers turning their lenses, no ripple of excitement trailing behind him. Keanu Reeves walked in through a narrow side path, dressed simply, moving with the unhurried calm of someone who had learned long ago that meaning did not announce itself. He nodded politely to the guards, his expression gentle, his presence almost blending into the stone walls and greenery around him. While others came to witness a ceremony, he came to fulfill something quieter, something promised without words. He paused near the courtyard, letting the sound of violins drift past him. The music did not stir excitement in his chest so much as memory. Years earlier, in a moment that had never made headlines, Anna had once spoken to him about fear, about doubt, about wondering whether kindness had a place in a world that often rewarded noise instead. She had smiled when she said it, but her eyes had been serious. "If I ever find real love," she had said, "promise you'll be there, even if you say nothing." He had promised then, not knowing when or how it would matter, only that promises spoken from the heart rarely expired. The ceremony began beneath open skies, petals floating softly through the air as guests rose to their feet. Anna walked forward, each step measured, each breath steady, her gaze locking with Tom's in a way that made the crowd fade into silence. Vows were exchanged with trembling voices, words spoken slowly, deliberately, as if both understood the weight they carried. Love, in that moment, felt fragile and immense at the same time. And among the faces watching, Keanu's expression remained calm, though his eyes carried a depth shaped by things he had never spoken aloud. Unnoticed by most, a small wooden box wrapped in silver ribbon was placed among the wedding gifts. It bore no card, no signature, no indication of where it had come from. Only a faint engraving on the lid caught the light briefly before disappearing again into shadow, for the day love becomes real. No one touched it. No one asked about it, yet its presence felt deliberate, patient, as if it understood timing better than people ever could. After the ceremony, celebrations spilled into the courtyard in waves of music and laughter. Fireworks later painted the sky in brief, brilliant bursts, and the world seemed to get exactly the spectacle it had expected. But in the middle of it all, Anna noticed Keanu standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, his smile gentle, distant, unclaimed by the noise around him. She walked toward him, the hem of her dress brushing the stone, and thanked him for coming. He nodded, his voice low, steady. Some promises are meant to be kept in silence. Before she could ask anything more, he glanced briefly toward the silver-wrapped box and added almost as an afterthought, "Open it when the night feels quiet. It isn't from me, it's from kindness itself." The words unsettled her in a way she couldn't explain. When she turned back, he was already stepping away, disappearing through the same path he had arrived on, leaving no trace except a feeling that something important had just brushed past her life. Later, when the music softened and the celebration thinned into smaller circles of conversation, Anna and Tom found themselves alone with the unopened gifts. The silver box seemed to wait for them. With a nervous smile, Anna untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside lay an old, worn notebook, its pages yellowed with time, its spine softened by years of handling. On the first page, written in careful handwriting, were words that stopped her breath. Love doesn't begin with a wedding. It begins when you understand someone's silence. Beneath the notebook was a letter, unsigned except for a single initial. Tom looked up instinctively, his eyes searching the crowd, but Keanu was already gone. Anna felt a tightness in her chest as understanding flickered at the edges of her thoughts. This was not a gift meant to impress. It was something else entirely. That night, long after the villa fell quiet, Anna sat alone by a window, the Tuscan sky stretched wide above her. She opened the letter, her hands trembling slightly as she read words written not to celebrate a marriage, but to remind her of who she was when no one was watching. It spoke of moments she barely remembered, of kindness she had given without thinking, of a night years ago when she had nearly given up and a stranger had handed her a cup of coffee and told her to stay gentle. The realization struck slowly, painfully, beautifully. That stranger had been Keanu. As tears blurred her vision, Anna understood that the wedding gift was never meant to belong to one day. It was meant to change many. And somewhere beyond the hills, beyond the applause and headlines, a quiet legacy had just begun to move again. The silence that followed the applause. The villa did not truly fall asleep that night. Long after the last guests had gone, after the music had faded into memory and the candles had burned down to fragile stubs of wax, something remained awake in the quiet corners of the stone walls. Anna sat by the window with the notebook resting in her lap, the weight of it heavier than it had any right to be. Outside, Tuscany breathed slowly, the hills wrapped in moonlight, the wind carrying the scent of jasmine and rain. Inside her chest, however, nothing felt still. Every page she had turned felt like it had turned something inside her as well, loosening memories she hadn't known were waiting. She read carefully, almost reverently, afraid that rushing would somehow break the fragile truth stitched into the handwriting. Each entry was short but dense with meaning. Stories of people whose names meant nothing to the world yet seemed to mean everything to the man who had written them. There were no grand declarations, no self-praise, only quiet observations about lives intersecting for brief moments and leaving behind something gentler than before. Anna felt tears slide down her cheeks without drama or resistance, because for the first time in years she was not crying from pain or joy, but from recognition. She was seeing a version of goodness that did not ask to be seen. Tom found her there sometime near dawn, standing silently in the doorway as he watched her turn another page. He did not interrupt. He had learned over years of life that some moments asked not for questions, but for presence. When she finally looked up, her eyes were tired but illuminated by something deeper than excitement. She handed him the notebook without a word. As he read, the confident rhythm that usually carried him through the world slowed, his shoulders settling as if he were stepping into a truth he hadn't known how to articulate before. "What is this really?" he asked quietly, though the tone of his voice suggested he already knew the answer wasn't simple. Anna looked back toward the window, watching the first hints of sunrise touch the sky. "It's a map," she said softly, "but not of places, of people, of unfinished kindness." The words surprised even her as she spoke them, yet they felt undeniably true. The notebook was not a memory book. It was a responsibility passed gently from one soul to another. Later that morning, while the world believed the newly married couple had disappeared into private celebration, Anna made a decision she did not announce. She packed a small bag, tucked the notebook carefully inside, and left the villa quietly. The train station was nearly empty, the early hour wrapping everything in a hush that felt intentional. As the train pulled away, Tuscany receded behind her, replaced by open countryside and long stretches of thought. Newspapers on nearby seats displayed photographs of her wedding, smiling faces frozen in perfect happiness, while she stared out the window, holding on to something far more fragile and far more real. The address written near the back of the notebook led her to a town outside Rome, small enough that it felt like time itself had slowed there. Cobblestone streets curved gently between aging buildings, balconies overflowed with flowers, and children's laughter echoed without urgency. Anna walked slowly, absorbing the place, following instinct as much as direction, until she reached a modest bookstore tucked between a cafe and a closed tailor shop. The sign above the door read Luna di Carta, its paint faded but carefully maintained. as if someone believed preservation mattered. Inside, the smell of old paper and wood wrapped around her immediately. An elderly woman sat behind the counter, arranging books with hands that moved slowly but purposefully. When she looked up, her eyes softened, not with surprise but with recognition. "You're the one he spoke about," she said gently, as though continuing a conversation that had begun long before Anna arrived. The words sent a chill through Anna's spine. "He told me someone would come holding his notebook," the woman continued. "Someone who still believed silence could mean something." They spoke for a long time, voices low, time stretching in a way that felt deliberate. The woman told her stories of a quiet man who came often, who paid debts without explanation, who bought books for children and left before anyone could thank him. He never spoke of who he was. He never stayed long. He only asked that kindness be allowed to travel forward. Before Anna left, the woman handed her a sealed envelope and a photograph. In the image, Keanu sat beside 3 children near a broken fountain, his expression peaceful, unguarded, almost weightless. On the back, written in the same familiar hand, were words that tightened Anna's throat. "If you can change one day for someone, you've already changed a life." The envelope contained only a single sentence. "Maria Elena is not someone to find. She is someone to remind." The meaning did not reveal itself immediately, but Anna felt the pull of it, the way truth sometimes makes itself known not through clarity, but through urgency. By the time she found the small church near the river, the sun was already lowering, light filtering through cracked stained glass and painting the floor in fractured color. Inside, a young woman sat on the ground, painting quietly, her movements hesitant, as if she were afraid of finishing what she started. When Anna spoke her name, the woman looked up slowly, eyes guarded yet familiar in a way that felt almost inherited. They talked for hours, words coming gently, unfolding stories of loss, of abandonment, of belief interrupted too many times to count. When Anna showed her the photograph, Maria Elena's hands shook as tears fell freely, unashamed. "He told me someone would come," Maria whispered, "someone who could help me believe again." Anna didn't promise miracles. She didn't offer speeches or solutions. She stayed. She helped repair windows, clean floors, repaint walls. Each day they worked in quiet companionship, reading from the notebook at night, letting the words fill the empty spaces between them. With every passing day, the church grew warmer, brighter, less broken. And so did Maria. Back in Tuscany, Tom noticed the silence left behind. At first, concern crept in quietly, then understanding followed. He reread the notebook alone, letting its meaning settle in places he had long kept armored. When Anna finally called him, her voice steady and certain, he didn't hesitate. "Send me the location," he said simply. He knew then that this journey was not pulling her away from him. It was pulling both of them toward something larger. That night, as Anna closed the notebook once more, one line stood out with new clarity. "Real gifts are not opened with hands, but with hearts willing to listen." She pressed the book to her chest, feeling the weight of what had been entrusted to her. Somewhere far beyond the reach of applause, a quiet promise was continuing to move, carried not by fame or ceremony, but by choice. And the world, though it did not yet know it, had already begun to change. Where kindness learned to breathe again. The journey back toward Rome unfolded in long stretches of quiet, the road slipping beneath the car like a ribbon unspooling memories that had waited years to be touched. Anna watched the landscape pass by, fields and hills dissolving into one another, while the notebook rested on her knees, its pages gently shifting with every turn as if reminding her it was still alive, still guiding. The days she had spent with Maria Elena had altered something fundamental inside her, not through dramatic revelations but through small, persistent acts that proved healing did not announce itself. It arrived slowly, often disguised as patience, as listening, as staying when leaving would have been easier. With each mile, Anna felt the weight of responsibility deepen, not as a burden, but as a calling she could no longer pretend not to hear. When Tom arrived at the small town near the river, his presence carried none of the urgency Anna had once associated with him. He moved through the church quietly, taking in the repaired windows, the fresh paint, the canvases leaning against stone walls that had once felt abandoned. He listened more than he spoke as Maria Elena shared her story, her voice steadier now, her eyes no longer fixed on the floor. Watching her speak, Tom began to understand something he had never learned on stages or sets, that transformation rarely came from being rescued and almost always came from being trusted. That realization settled in him with surprising ease, dissolving parts of himself he had not known were still rigid. They stayed for several days, long enough to see laughter return naturally, long enough for the church to feel less like a refuge and more like a beginning. On the final evening, as the sun sank behind the riverbank and painted the sky in muted gold, Maria Elena handed on a small folded paper heart, its edges worn, its shape imperfect. "He gave me one once," she said softly. "He said it carried a wish I would understand later." Anna held it carefully, recognizing the quiet symbolism immediately. This was how the notebook spoke, not in commands but in echoes. Their next destination revealed itself not through instruction, but through discovery. As Anna turned the notebook's pages again that night, she noticed markings she had overlooked before, faint impressions beneath the ink, addresses pressed so lightly they seemed to appear only when the light struck at the right angle. One name surfaced repeatedly, written near the margins as if deliberately hidden. Sophia. Beneath it, a single line repeated twice, once in ink and once as if etched by memory alone. Find where it began. The orphanage stood on the edge of Florence, modest and weathered, surrounded by ivy that climbed its walls with quiet determination. Children's drawings covered the interior walls, stars and bridges and hearts sketched in crayon with a sincerity that felt almost sacred. Sophia greeted them at the gate with a look that blended recognition and relief, as though she had been waiting not for a person, but for a continuation. She spoke of a man who arrived years ago carrying grief like an unspoken language, who worked with his hands, who taught children to read without ever telling them his name. He never posed for photographs. He never accepted thanks. He only asked that kindness be allowed to move forward when he no longer could. In the center of the garden stood a simple stone heart, hollowed carefully, sheltering a small metal box within. When Anna opened it, the letter inside did not feel like a conclusion but an invitation. It spoke of circles rather than endings, of bridges rather than destinations, of how every act of compassion created a path someone else would one day need. It asked her to leave the notebook there, where it had been born, and to begin another of her own, not as a replacement, but as proof that kindness evolved rather than repeated. Anna's hands trembled as she placed the old notebook back into its resting place, sealing it gently. The moment felt irreversible, like stepping fully into a truth she could no longer step away from. She pulled out a blank notebook, its pages untouched, and laid it beside the stone heart. The children gathered around curiously, their laughter drifting through the garden like wind through leaves. When one of them asked what the new book would be called, Anna smiled with a certainty that surprised her. "The Heart That Keeps Giving," she said, understanding at last that legacy was not about being remembered but about being continued. The following days unfolded with an ease that felt earned rather than accidental. Tom worked alongside volunteers, repairing fences and classrooms, his movements stripped of urgency, focused entirely on the present moment. Anna spent hours with the children, listening to their stories, encouraging their drawings, discovering that creation itself could be a form of healing. At night, when silence returned, she wrote names into the new notebook, not as a record of achievement, but as a promise to stay connected. Each name carried a story still unfolding, a bridge still forming. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Anna noticed a photograph tucked behind the final page of the old notebook she had nearly missed. In it, she stood alongside Tom and the quiet man whose presence had shaped this journey, taken years earlier on a film set, none of them aware of what lay ahead. On the back, faded but deliberate, were words that lingered in her chest long after she read them. "When the bridge is ready, the world will know." The realization did not arrive as shock but as calm certainty. This had never been about a wedding gift or even about a single act of generosity. It was about creating pathways strong enough to outlast individual lives. As Anna closed the stone heart and stepped back into the garden, she felt something settle within her, not closure but clarity. The story was not ending, it was widening. And somewhere, beyond the reach of celebration and attention, kindness was learning to breathe again, carried forward by those willing to listen when silence spoke. The bridge the world didn't see. The morning they left Florence felt different from every departure Anna had known before, not because it carried urgency, but because it carried intention. The orphanage faded behind them slowly, the stone walls and children's laughter lingering in Anna's chest like a second heartbeat. And as the car moved forward, she realized that what she was leaving was not a place, but a version of herself that no longer fit. The blank notebook rested between her and Tom, already heavier than its pages suggested, filled with names that had begun to breathe, stories that no longer felt distant or abstract. The road ahead stretched long and quiet, winding through countryside and thought alike, And in that silence, Anna understood something she had never fully grasped before. Kindness did not ask for permission to grow, it only asked for commitment. Their next stop was unplanned in the way the most important moments often are. A coastal town near Rome appeared almost accidentally on the map. Yet the moment they arrived, Anna felt the unmistakable pull she had learned to trust. The sea met the land there without drama, waves brushing stone walls with patient rhythm, fishermen repairing nets beneath skies that had seen centuries pass without comment. An old woman sat near the pier feeding birds, her movements slow but deliberate, and when she looked up at Anna, recognition crossed her face like sunlight breaking through cloud. She spoke of a quiet man who had visited every spring, who listened more than he spoke, who left folded paper hearts for children and never stayed long enough to be thanked. When she pulled one of those fragile hearts from her bag, yellowed by time but still intact, Anna's hands shook as she unfolded it, reading words written long ago yet somehow perfectly timed. Your pain made you kind. Don't let the world take that gift away. The realization that followed did not overwhelm her, it steadied her. This was not coincidence, and it was not fate in the dramatic sense the world liked to celebrate. It was continuity. Each place, each person, each small act had been connected by a single belief that goodness could outlast suffering if someone chose to carry it forward. Tom saw it too, not as an idea, but as a responsibility settling into his posture, changing the way he listened, the way he spoke. That night, as they sat by the water with the sound of waves filling the spaces between them, he said quietly that this felt larger than anything he had ever been part of. And Anna knew he meant larger than careers, larger than recognition, larger even than love as it was usually defined. It was then that another name surfaced, not written in ink but implied through memory, through the subtle way the notebook seemed to guide rather than instruct. Sandra Bullock had been absent from the story so far not because she did not belong in it, but because her role was never meant to arrive loudly. Anna reached out to her not with explanation but with honesty, describing the journey not as a mission, but as a question she could no longer ignore. Sandra listened without interruption, her silence attentive rather than uncertain, and when Anna finished, she said only that she would come. No press, no announcements, no spectacle, just presence. When Sandra arrived, she did not step into the story as an observer. She moved through the coastal town with the same quiet respect Anna had learned, sitting with the old woman by the pier, listening to fishermen speak of storms and seasons, watching children play without needing to be noticed. There was something grounding in her presence, something that carried its own history of loss and resilience, and Anna felt the unspoken understanding between them deepen quickly. Sandra had known grief intimately, had learned that survival often depended not on being strong, but on staying gentle when strength seemed impossible. She recognized the language of the notebook immediately, not as sentiment, but as truth earned the hard way. The decision to expand what they were building did not come during a meeting or a plan, but during a shared silence one evening as the sun slipped into the sea. Sandra spoke first, her voice calm, certain, as she said that kindness needed infrastructure as much as intention, that belief alone could not carry the weight of the world without places to rest. Schools, shelters, clinics, bridges of the literal and figurative kind were not symbols, they were necessities. Anna felt the words settle into her chest like a missing piece clicking into place. This was the next step, not replacing what had begun, but giving it room to grow. They traveled next to the mountains, following a set of coordinates discovered behind a folded page Anna had nearly missed, and there, hidden among pine trees and snowfall, they found the remnants of an old wooden bridge spanning a river that cut through the village like a scar. Half of it had collapsed years ago, storms tearing through what had once connected families and seasons. Yet signs of repair were visible, newer wood reinforced quietly, lanterns left behind as if someone believed the bridge would be crossed again. The villagers spoke of a man who came every spring to rebuild what the floods destroyed, who worked through cold and silence, who left before the thaw fully set in. Under the pale morning light, Anna, Tom, and Sandra stood together on the broken edge of that bridge, the river rushing below with relentless honesty. No speeches were made. No decisions were debated. They simply began to work. Villagers joined, then children, carrying tools and lanterns, laughter rising naturally as hands grew busy. The act of rebuilding became a shared rhythm, a reminder that healing often required effort from more than one heart. When the final plank was set and the bridge stood whole again beneath the rising sun, Anna noticed a small metal plate embedded near the center, its words simple and unadorned. Kindness is the only bridge that never falls. That night, as lanterns reflected across the water and the village gathered quietly, Sandra stood beside Anna, her expression softened by something like peace. She said that the world would eventually hear about this, not because they would tell it, but because kindness had a way of revealing itself through those it touched. Anna believed her. She felt it in the way the river sounded different now, in the way the air carried less weight. Somewhere, the quiet legacy that had begun with one man choosing silence over recognition had become something larger, something that no longer belonged to any single person. And as the stars spread across the sky, watching over a bridge rebuilt not just of wood but of shared purpose, Anna understood that the story had passed another threshold. It was no longer about discovering kindness. It was about sustaining it, protecting it, and trusting that once set in motion, it could carry the world farther than anyone could walk alone. The weight of carrying light. What Anna did not expect, as the work spread from village to village and from quiet intention into visible action, was how heavy kindness could become when it no longer lived in the shadows. The bridge in the mountains had barely finished settling into place when word began to travel, not through announcements or interviews, but through the people who had crossed it, the families who no longer had to walk miles around the river, the children who carried lanterns home and spoke about strangers who helped without asking who they were. Stories moved faster than plans ever could, and with them came attention, questions, curiosity, and eventually pressure. Anna felt it first in the tightening of her chest when emails began arriving from people who wanted to help, but also wanted to shape, brand, and define what was happening. Kindness, she realized, became vulnerable the moment others tried to own it. Tom saw the shift too, not as resistance, but as a test. He had lived long enough in public life to recognize the moment when something pure risked being diluted by expectation. Meetings began to replace silence, and conversations grew crowded with language that sounded helpful but felt heavy. Terms like scalability and visibility crept into discussions that had once been about listening and rebuilding. Sandra remained steady through it all, often saying less than anyone else in the room, but when she did speak, her words cut gently through the noise. She reminded them that the bridges they were building were not metaphors for influence but commitments to presence, and that the moment the work stopped feeling human was the moment it stopped being true. Despite their resolve, doubt found Anna late at night when the world quieted and responsibility lingered. She would sit alone with the blank notebook now half filled, reading names written carefully in her own hand, wondering whether she was doing enough or perhaps too much. The legacy she carried felt vast, and there were moments when she feared that by bringing it into the open, she might betray the very silence that had given it life. In those moments, she returned to memory rather than instruction, recalling the calm steadiness of the man who had never tried to save the world, only to show up where he was needed and leave when the work was done. The turning point came unexpectedly in a city far removed from mountains and villages, where concrete replaced stone and urgency replaced patience. They had arrived to assess a shelter that had fallen into disrepair, a place overwhelmed by demand and underfunded by promises that never arrived. Cameras waited outside, uninvited but persistent, and Anna felt the familiar tightening again, the sense that the work was being watched rather than supported. Inside, however, she met a woman who had been running the shelter alone for years, her voice tired but unbroken, her belief intact despite exhaustion. The woman did not ask for funding first. She asked if Anna would sit with her for a moment and listen. They sat on the edge of a narrow bed in a quiet room while the city pressed in from outside. The woman spoke of nights when she almost closed the doors, of mornings when she stayed open because one person showed up who had nowhere else to go. She said something then that stayed with Anna long after they left. "People think kindness is soft," she said, "but it's the hardest thing I've ever done." The truth of it landed with weight. Kindness was not fragile. It was demanding, relentless, and often lonely. That night, Anna dreamed of the old notebook, not as pages but as a bridge stretching endlessly forward, each plank etched with names she had not yet written. She woke with clarity rather than fear. The next morning, she gathered Tom and Sandra and spoke plainly, without strategy or rehearsal. She said they would continue, but not at the cost of what had made the work meaningful. There would be no rushing to satisfy attention, no expansion without presence, no stories told without consent. They would build slowly, deliberately, and sometimes invisibly, trusting that impact did not need applause to be real. Sandra smiled when Anna finished speaking, a quiet, knowing smile, and said that this was the moment the work truly became theirs. Tom agreed, adding that strength was not proven by scale but by sustainability. Together, they chose restraint over reach, depth over speed, and in doing so, rediscovered the rhythm that had guided them from the beginning. The results did not announce themselves immediately, but they came. A school opened quietly in a place that had been waiting for years. A clinic received supplies without ceremony. A bridge was repaired without anyone attaching a name to it. And in each place, someone left behind a folded paper heart, not as a signature, but as a reminder that kindness had passed through and would move on again. Anna returned one evening to the stone heart in the orphanage garden, standing alone beneath a sky full of stars. She did not open it this time. She did not need to. The message no longer lived on the page. It lived in choice, in restraint, in the willingness to carry light without insisting it be seen. As she turned to leave, she felt neither pride nor completion, only readiness. The world would continue to test the work. It would misunderstand it, attempt to shape it, try to claim it. But the bridge had already been built where it mattered most, inside those who had learned that kindness was not a moment, a gift, or a legacy to protect. It was a practice, renewed every day by the simple decision to stay human. And still, one final chapter waited, not to conclude the story, but to release it fully into the world. When the world finally understood. The moment the story reached the world did not arrive with a breaking headline or a dramatic announcement, and in that quietness, it remained faithful to everything it had ever been. It began instead with a photograph that surfaced without warning, shared by someone who had crossed the rebuilt bridge in the mountains and posted it simply because it felt important. The image showed lantern light reflected on water, children standing barefoot on wooden planks, and three figures in the distance working with their sleeves rolled up, their faces indistinct, their identities secondary to the act itself. There were no captions explaining what it meant, no names attached to claim credit. Yet within hours, the image traveled farther than any campaign ever could, stirring something old and forgotten in people who did not yet know why it mattered. Questions followed as they always did, but answers did not rush to meet them. Anna watched the ripples spread with a mix of calm and uncertainty, aware that once a story entered public consciousness, it could never fully be guided again. Articles speculated, commentators debated, and voices tried to define what was happening in language that felt both too loud and too small. Some wanted heroes. Others wanted controversy. A few wanted ownership. But what they found instead was resistance to simplification. Every time someone tried to frame the movement as a brand or a performance, another story emerged quietly to complicate it. A teacher speaking about a school built without ceremony, a nurse describing a clinic that arrived just before it was needed most, a family crossing a bridge that had once separated their lives. The invitation to speak publicly came eventually, not because Anna sought it, but because silence alone could no longer protect the truth from distortion. Standing before an audience that filled a modest hall rather than a stadium, she felt none of the adrenaline she once associated with attention. Instead, she felt the weight of responsibility, not to impress but to clarify. When she spoke, her voice carried no urgency, only steadiness, as she told the story not as a revelation but as a continuation. She spoke of a wedding gift that was never meant to be opened all at once, of a notebook that did not record success but connection, of kindness that traveled invisibly until someone chose to carry it forward. She did not say his name at first. She spoke of a man who believed silence could save what noise often destroyed, who helped not because it was noble but because it was necessary, who understood that legacy was not something you left behind but something you stepped away from so others could reach it. When she finally spoke the name, it did not land as a revelation but as recognition, as if the world had always known it and simply needed permission to say it aloud. The room did not erupt in applause. It fell into a stillness that felt earned. Sandra stood beside her, not as a witness but as a reminder that resilience did not always look like triumph. When she spoke, she did not add to the story so much as deepen it, speaking of loss as a teacher rather than a wound, of how kindness often arrived not to fix pain but to sit with it until it became survivable. Tom spoke last, briefly, acknowledging that the most difficult work he had ever done was not learning how to lead, but learning when not to. Together, they refused to define the movement beyond its values, making it clear that there would be no hierarchy of goodness, no central ownership, no expectation of recognition. In the days that followed, something extraordinary happened without coordination or instruction. People began leaving folded paper hearts in public places, not as symbols of allegiance but as quiet invitations. A note on a bus seat read simply, "You matter today." A heart tucked into a library book carried a message that said, "Take your time." At a hospital, a nurse found one with the words, "Thank you for staying." No one traced them back. No one tried to claim them. They moved through cities and villages alike, crossing borders and languages with ease, carried by the same understanding that had built bridges and schools and shelters without asking permission. Anna returned once more to the villa in Tuscany, long after the world had moved on to newer stories, standing alone where the wedding had taken place. The stone paths felt unchanged, but she knew she was not. She did not look for closure there, only gratitude. The gift she had received that day had not changed the world because it was grand or surprising, but because it reminded people of something they already knew and had forgotten how to practice. Kindness did not belong to the exceptional. It belonged to the willing. On a quiet evening months later, as the sun slipped behind the hills and shadows lengthened across the courtyard, Anna found herself smiling at a memory rather than chasing a future. She understood now that the man who had given her the notebook had never intended for his story to be told in full. He had trusted that if the bridge was strong enough, people would cross it without needing to know who built it. And they had. Somewhere a school bell rang where there had once been silence. Somewhere a river was crossed without fear. Somewhere a folded paper heart was opened by someone who needed it more than they knew. The world did not change all at once. It changed the only way it ever had, one quiet choice at a time. And that was the secret of the wedding gift, not that it transformed everything overnight, but that it taught the world how to keep transforming itself, long after the giver had stepped back into silence, trusting humanity to carry the light forward.